We are not up the creek today. Hopefully, we will be next week as Tim May returns. Frank Mitchell here, and hopefully Tim will be back tomorrow. In the meantime, we're still talking to interesting people, being a Thursday especially, and a very interesting local person, a character, I would say, but in a very positive way, is a gentleman by the name of Russ Hodge. Russ, thank you for stopping by today.
And I love being named a character for a guy who does a show every day with Tim May.
Oh, I'll take that compliment, being a character, anytime.
Well, I do too. And by the way, we wish Tim well in his battle with distemper.
Yeah, I hope Tim is listening and caught that. Russ, let's introduce you and what you do to people who might not be too familiar. Some people know, but for those who don't, Three Roads Communication. What the heck is that? I do know it's a local business that people do not know about. That's very interesting.
Three Roads Communications is a television and video production company. We have been based in Frederick since 1993, although the vast majority of our work has been done in Washington, New York, Los Angeles, and internationally. We specialize in producing documentaries and PBS programming, and we are unique with production companies. Most production companies can produce something, they have cameras, they have lights, they can possibly tell the story. We do that, but we also handle the distribution so that our programs are seen nationally and internationally. We even have a very large distribution deal for streaming, so after the programs begin their airing on PBS across the country, then they are also on streaming platforms as well. So
okay.
We're kind of a new model, I guess you would say, in an old way for television, video production, factually based programming. We like to think of ourselves, and I think we are journalistically sound. We don't take a stand on anything. We do the kind of Jack Webb and Dragnet, just the facts ma'am approach to things, and let people draw their own conclusions.
Which is really cool because you are a major media force based in Frederick.
Yes.
What's your story? How'd you get involved in all this?
All right, so I'm from New York, as probably most of you have figured out from my accent. I moved to Frederick in the late 80s because I was producing political shows in Washington.
We won't call you a newcomer.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm not here for 4 generations. So
Wow.
I am, yeah, I'm a newbie. I used to produce political shows like McLaughlin Group. I started John McLaughlin's nightly show on CNBC.
Morton?
Yes, exactly. The late, somewhat on.
Some will appreciate that.
Yes. Back in the day, the old style political shows, and then went out on my own after producing a show that was kind of a forerunner for Jon Stewart's program called Off the Record. I can't believe I don't remember, for Fox, and that was before Fox was actually a network. And then went out on my own. My first client was Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher.
Wow.
My second client was the Alzheimer's Association in Frederick County, and have just been going now for 35 years, doing corporate videos, government videos, TV series, and a lot of documentary work.
And we shared a friendship. Both worked with someone who was pretty well known among a number of people in Frederick, that being Josh Brooks, who used to work here and worked for you.
Wonderful, wonderful guy. And Josh and I, for years, our studios were located down in Arlington, so Josh and I would make that trek every day with me driving and hitting the brakes so that the coffee would spill all over his seersucker suits every time, and he never caught on to it. He was a wonderful man. I love Josh.
So anyway, I wanted you to stop by because you have recently produced a documentary I thought was very interesting that appeared on Maryland Public Television, I guess is where I first saw it.
It's been broadcast 400 times around the country, including, I'm going to do my pitch here, it's been seen in 18 of the top 20 television markets.
Wow, I didn't realize.
Yes, so it's been seen in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, all of them, and in Washington market, which they call it, MPT, WHUT, which is the Howard University station, and WETA all have aired it more than a dozen times, many of them in prime time. So we've gotten very, very good coverage. The documentary is called The House on Jonathan Street.
Yep. And go ahead. And then I was also going to tease, we are going to talk about, for those of you who have heard something called Inspired, which is about the city of Frederick. We want to talk about that, too, because that's a current project.
That's a current project, yes. It's kind of a bookend to the documentary about Jonathan Street in Hagerstown, in that you have kind of this Harvard Business School case study of these two towns that are 25 miles away from each other and have had radically different histories over the past 70 years, and had radically different histories beforehand as well. It's kind of a fascinating look at what's happened in America over the past 70 years or so.
Okay, so let's start with Jonathan Street, as that has been running. I didn't realize it had that. Wow, much of a distribution. And what it's about is Jonathan Street in Hagerstown, and it starts with real estate, going back quite a bit in history, and I guess take it from there.
It's a fascinating story. Came across it in the Baltimore Sun, and right after the pandemic started, and it's the basic story. Jonathan Street, for those who don't know, is kind of the most notorious street in Hagerstown, and it is the traditionally African-American neighborhood. There was a cop car in 2018 that was chasing someone the wrong way down Jonathan Street, slid off the road in a rainstorm and crashed into this tiny little cabin, and the city condemned it. And they came in, a man named Joel Murbaugh, who's a demolition expert who's been doing this for decades, came in and started taking the siding off, and he stopped the demolition right away because he realized that the wood and the beams in the house were significant. And he got community people involved. They brought in Preservation Maryland. They brought in the State Highway Department, which, believe it or not, has an archaeological department, who did all sorts of studies, and it determined that the wood from the cabin, the beams that held up the cabin, actually traced their lineage back to the European founder of Hagerstown, Jonathan Hager. So this house had been there for 300 years, had witnessed all the history of Hagerstown. So we kind of made that a character in the documentary, and through that we were able to tell the story, not only what happened in Hagerstown, not only what happened on Jonathan Street, but what happened nationally as well. So we take events like Brown versus Board of Education, and we talk about what happened nationally, and then we say, here's how they handled it in Hagerstown. And for the students on Jonathan Street who were going to a segregated school, here's how it impacted them. So we took it from a macro to a micro level, and interviewed probably about 45 different people, everybody from Governor Moore and Senator Van Hollen, to local residents, to politicians, to historians, to preservationists. So we have this huge, rich archive of history of what's happened in Hagerstown, and how Hagerstown actually affected national history too, of course. Battle in Antietam, a lot of things like that. John Brown's cabin, which still stands out in the area, which had a very unique renaissance back in the late 40s when it was purchased by a group called the Black Elks and turned into a concert venue. Almost nobody in Hagerstown knows that people like James Brown and Ray Charles and everybody else used to go through there and play concerts.
I never realized that. It was fascinating to hear that.
You didn't realize it probably because it was exclusively held for the African-American community.
Yeah.
So when we do presentations to Rotary clubs up there and all that stuff, it's funny, you see a bunch of white people in their 60s and 70s who say, we had no idea this was going on right in our backyard.
And the black folks are nodding their heads like, oh, yeah, I remember.
But what's funny is when we interviewed a lot of the residents there, because it was also somewhat of a notorious place, there was almost nobody who would ever admit to actually going to the concerts and the dances that were held there, because you could see they were still looking in their eyes and realizing their parents would yell at them for rise from the grave and yell at them for going there. So they always had a cousin who attended or something else. But it's a fascinating story. The state has put a historic marker on Jonathan Street, and also significantly the two guys who were basically the driving forces in getting the cabin renovated and resold also have secured over $3 million in grants. So the former segregated school up there, which is now a community center, is being renovated. There was a segregated pool there that has been closed for 20 years. That's fixed now. So there have been all these remarkable changes, and it has to be because the community kind of put a stake in the ground and said, you're not tearing down our history, you're not tearing down this cabin, it's too important, you've done it too many times to us. And then everything that came out, there was a lot of national publicity about that cabin too. I mean, Jonathan Street itself, before the 60s and 70s and before what happened to so many of these towns, was really a significant area. It was called the Black Wall Street of Maryland.
Yeah.
There were a lot of businesses there, and practically speaking, the people in the neighborhood would work during the day, go back into the neighborhood at night because honestly, they were not welcome in much of the rest of the town, and they would spend their money on that street. So there were barbershops and pawn shops, PAWN shops, and restaurants, and a famous hotel. It was in the Green Book. That's actually where Willie Mays played his first baseball game, which was in the documentary, and he stayed at the Harmon Hotel. When he died a few months back, that became a big story again because he was not treated well in Hagerstown. So,
yeah. So what you're saying, a lot of this documentary has to do with the history of African Americans in Hagerstown, but not totally. It's not just about that, but that is a significant part of it.
That is, and that's kind of the theatrical device, if you will, of making the cabin as a character in the documentary, a witness to the history.
How far back do you go? When does it
We go all the way back to actually Native Americans in Hagerstown beforehand, yes.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Jonathan Street was both, it was German up until the 1860s or so, and then African Americans started moving in. A woman who owned that cabin in the late 1860s, a woman named Annie Bentley, she was a domestic, and she wound up owning several properties on that street. So you have to think to yourself, well, here's a very good business brain who can manage to parlay a maid salary into owning several pieces of property.
How did that property shift from being owned by a German immigrant to the people you're talking about?
I think it was part of the natural progression that happened there. And when they did the archaeological dig, what they found through, the shards of glass and everything else that they could get, and the bones, was that the African Americans actually ate higher on the hog than the Germans did because they could date that sort of thing. So, and it would stand to reason that they were German immigrants there because Hager, if the wood came from Hager's property and from his former house, so that was the area that they settled in to begin with, and then slowly there was the transition. It's all these things that you unearth that really kind of get to the core of what a city is and what a town is. And, cities and towns, if Citizens United could say corporations are people, then cities and towns are people in a way, too. They have their own personalities. They have their own idiosyncrasies. And it's really interesting to unearth what they are. And that's what we're doing with Frederick right now as well.
Yeah, and we have our listeners in Washington County and Hagerstown in particular, but it is somewhat regional, just the house on Jonathan Street story, because it does talk about a John Brown story, out of Harper's Ferry. And I want to segue from that to your current project, because that's what I wanted maybe the bulk of the time for you to talk about, Russ, when you stop by. But it kind of segues almost from one to the other, because you do mention in the Jonathan Street documentary differences between what happened with Frederick and what happened with Hagerstown. What are some of those differences?
It kind of shows the ever-changing nature of the world.
And Hagerstown being more manufacturing-based.
Yes. Hagerstown made a deliberate decision to go with manufacturing and railroads. Frederick rejected that. It's interesting. Frederick 200 years ago was the fastest growing county in Maryland.
Really?
Then it took a 200-year hiatus, basically, and now it's the fastest growing county in Maryland again. Frederick seemed to be a little bit more considered in what they wanted for the town and more agriculturally based. Hagerstown went full force for manufacturing, and they had an incredible story. During World War II, Fairchild Aircraft up there made all the PT trainers that every pilot had to train on. They employed 10,000 people in Hagerstown, in a town of 30 to 40,000 people. There was the Moeller organ factory up there, where every church in America aspired to have a Moeller organ in there, and there were West Point and everything else. And they even got into making cars. It was an incredible industrial town, broad shoulders, people who took pride in really good work ethic. And then, like in much of America, those jobs started going away. So from 1980 to 2000, there were more jobs lost, more blue-collar jobs lost proportionally in the Hagerstown, Martinsburg, West Virginia census tract than there were anywhere else in America. Those jobs all went away. They either went to the South, they became automated, they went to China, and then Hagerstown's unemployment went up over 20%.
Yeah. This is the 80s we're talking about.
80s and 90s, back when Billy Joel sang Allentown.
Right.
It was happening in Hagerstown and across the country.
And other places too, yeah.
And then these people lost their jobs, which were by and large good-paying jobs where you could support a family and buy a car and take a vacation once in a while and own a house. Those jobs went away. And if you want to know what a source of anger among a particular demographic is in America, this is a perfect example. They feel like they were done wrong, and in many cases they were.
I remember, Russ, growing up and living in different places between, let's say, the D.C. Metro and Cumberland, Maryland, and everything in between, having friends from Hagerstown to Washington County, how much Fairchild and Mack Trucks and all these employers did for a middle class in Washington County.
Yep, and then it goes away. So economically, you're devastated. Also psychologically, if your dad worked on an assembly line and he was able to support you and your family, and you're not able to do that anymore, let's be honest, you feel like less of a man.
Right. But you got to be optimistic about Hagerstown, that it's trying and hopefully is somewhat and still going to make somewhat of a comeback with some of the things it's doing.
Absolutely. They have a lot of great stuff, including they have a new medical school coming in up there that'll be bringing 800 doctor trainees in, which should help change not only demographically, but change kind of the mindset of the town as well.
So now, a different story for two places that are, 25, 30 miles apart. We moved to Frederick County, and that's the project you're involved in right now, and that is something called Inspired, and it's obviously called Inspired because of the spires of Frederick.
You can't do anything about Frederick without putting those spires in there somewhere. Yeah. By the way, before I forget, I should mention two things so that the people who work with me don't get mad. One is FrederickInspired.com is our website if you want to find out more about it, and we have some clips and a promo video up there. Also, tomorrow evening at the Ordinary Hen Restaurant in downtown Frederick, which is the old Thatcher and Rye and the old Volt, we will be screening some rough cut segments of the Inspired documentary. So if people want to see what this is all about, they can come out and get a feel for it. It's not complete. It's still rough. Some of the words will change. Some of the images will change. And we have about 45 minutes of a rough cut done right now, so we need to add another 10 minutes, which we will do because God knows there's plenty of material about Frederick history.
If you could stick around a little longer, Russ, we'll get that plug in again and find out exactly why you might be interested in seeing Inspired, the next project for Three Roads Communications. We'll be back after the news break. Good afternoon. 4:10 is the time, and yes, it's Mid-Maryland Live. I'm Frank Mitchell, but no Tim May. He is a little under the weather. Won't give him too hard a time. Doesn't happen very often, but he's feeling okay. Just want him to lay back for another day, and he should be back tomorrow, hopefully. And therefore, we are not up the creek as we usually are on Thursdays. We're in studio here. But Russ, Hodge, what are you saying?
I'm saying you're up the creek here.
We're up the creek.
You got me as a guest, you're up the creek.
But not on the Carroll Creek, literally. We're just up the creek here.
That is correct.
Russ Hodge is who's here with me from Three Roads Communication, which is a media video production firm in Frederick, Maryland, and has done some very interesting projects. And we're spotlighting some of the local projects. We've been talking about the house on Jonathan Street, which has been showing, and I'm sure we'll show again on public television locally. And I didn't realize, man, you've had this on all kinds of cities.
All over the place.
All over the place.
Yes, yeah. We've covered 80% of the United States population has been able to see this. Not that they actually have, but they have been. It's available to them to say yes. Yeah.
Right, which is an interesting history of Hagerstown, a part of Hagerstown. By the way, I want to mention if you have any questions for Russ about any of these documentaries, we'll be checking on our text line, 301-694 WFMD, and we'll get more into open phones after 4:30 this afternoon. So, Mr. Russ, I want to move now to this Inspired. And you got to say, like, you can't say inspired. You got to say inspired.
There you go. Yes, that's like WNBC.
Yes. So what is Inspired?
Inspired is a full 300-year history of Frederick, Maryland. It is designed for a national audience. It is designed for cities and towns across America who are looking on how to revitalize their economy and their entire way of being, using examples and using kind of the lesson of what Frederick has done over the past 50 years to make themselves much more livable, much more desirable. And obviously, we all know about the economic boom happening here. Whether all of that is a good thing or bad, we make no judgment on, but we say, here's how we got here. 50 interviews, 50 interviews, and we're looking to do about 10 more to fill in various holes that we have. Again, very prominent people and residents and historians and business people like Don Linton and Bert Anderson who were there, and of course the inimitable Ron Young. And we spend a good part of the documentary tracing what Frederick did over the past 50 years or even 60 years, from even before the floods, and say, okay, here are the deliberate steps that were taken. It's a cumulative process. It's not just one thing that was done. It was a town pulling together business interests and the community and politicians to kind of realize a vision of what they thought Frederick should be. And it's obviously been very, very successful. And now the question is, how can that be replicated in other places while still maintaining, I hate to use the term gentrification, but we're all aware of all the development challenges that are going on. We even get into a little bit about the future of Frederick and as it pertains to data centers, and is that the future of Frederick, and a little bit of the impact on what the changing nature of Frederick has on its personality. Again, we treat Frederick as a kind of a human being, as a person.
Man, you're getting into a lot of things we talk about day to day. Presently and looking at the near future of what's going to happen here. You know, I wonder, Russ, if somebody listening, the first thing that's coming into their head is like, no, you're telling other people what a great place Frederick is? We don't want any more people here.
There has been some of that, yes.
Somebody has told you that?
Yes. We hear the gamut. A lot of it is also people getting in touch with us, telling us what their grandmother did and how that can be included in the documentary as well. But there is, there's certainly a portion of Frederictonians who would like to kind of draw up the moat, the bridge over the moat and keep everything out. It's not the country we live in. I think, success breeds more success. There's a lot of really interesting stuff when you delve into people who've been around and seen it and their impressions. Karen Norman from the Downtown Frederick Partnership said, most people think if you build an aquarium, that's going to change the fortunes of your town. Well, it's not one thing. It's the million things. It's Ron Young encouraging everybody to paint their houses in the 1960s. And I guess I should go back, because what's been interesting, I keep saying this for a national audience, which it is, but there are so many people who've moved to Frederick in the past 20 years who have no idea about its history.
Yep.
We were showing the clips to somebody the other day who was stationed at Fort Detrick in the early 90s and has been here 30 years. He had no idea about the floods that racked Frederick in the 1970s.
Yep.
But the really interesting story is Frederick's downtown was very much like downtowns all across America. In the 60s, people were moving to the suburbs, malls were being built, and the downtown was dying at that point. Then in 1972, there was Hurricane Agnes, which devastated the downtown. 4 years later, there was an even worse storm in 1976. And I mean, you know, it was national news. Richard Nixon was here, you know, all that sort of stuff flying over. And the merchants downtown was decimated. Marlene Young from the Delaplane Foundation talks about how there were Cadillacs from the dealership floating down Carroll Creek.
Yeah.
And the businesses could not get insurance. Nobody could get any bank loans to fix up their buildings after the floods. And, you know, there were deliberate decisions made to keep government buildings here. The Delaplanes decided to keep the Frederick News Post downtown because they thought that was important. The courthouse was built because the old courthouse used to be what's City Hall now. And so it was a deliberate decision, step by step, with a lot of lobbying, a lot of explaining, a lot of cajoling. And then Ron Young came up with the idea after going to visit, you know, the Riverwalk in San Antonio for the Carroll Creek project, and to divert the creek under the town, under the creek itself, and then do the top as economic development. Amazingly controversial. He had to fight. Again, there were always the people saying this is going to be too expensive, this is going to wreck the town. And what's really interesting is that under his administration, tax rates actually went down over a number of years despite building this. And he was very smart and very strategic. They would go to the state where there were and work together with Doc McClellan and a lot of the other people who were here, the legislators, to get funding from the state. But they would do it incrementally. They wouldn't ask for too much, and they wouldn't ask for too little. And it was a continuous lobbying and lobbying citizens. And one of the interesting things, we interviewed John Fiesla, who was familiar to many people here. When he first came to Frederick, he said Ron Young would be doing a press conference every Wednesday afternoon, and there were 3 media outlets in Frederick that would cover it: the paper, the radio station, and I think there was a second radio station. And that was a way to communicate with people. Well, that doesn't necessarily exist so much
And there were
anymore.
2 newspapers.
That's right.
A weekly and a daily.
I remember when I moved here in the late 80s, and I was shocked, coming from New York, that Frederick had a morning and afternoon paper.
Yeah.
It was absolutely amazing. So it was different times, but they were very smart, very strategic, very persistent, and very persuasive. And, you know, the old saying that, you know, you plant a tree that you may not sit under the shade of, that's what they did. Because a lot of the people are no longer around to see what it was that they have been able to accomplish and what Frederick has become now.
We're talking about some of what Russ has learned and is planning to show all of us in a documentary about Frederick called Inspired. And we'll get some final thoughts on this when we come back after the break. Mid-Maryland Live is on WFMD.
Clay Travis and Buck Sexton.
Here, but right now we're talking to Russ Hodge with Three Roads Communication in Frederick, talking about a project you've got going on. There's so many questions I'd have and so little time, Russ, that I'd like you to come back sometime in the near future.
I would love to. And by the way, for your viewers or your listeners, I'm thinking TV, tomorrow evening at the Ordinary Hen downtown, the old Volt restaurant, there will be a screening of selected rough-cut clips from the documentary. We'll be taking questions from the audience, too, so anybody who's interested has been piqued today, they can feel free to go there. You don't have to buy an expensive meal. You can sit there and have a beer and watch the clips and ask questions.
As much as you may think you know about the history of Frederick, there's probably something in there you did not know.
And there's lots of great stuff. For instance, we interviewed Beverly Byron, who's wonderful,
Sure.
okay? So she tells a story because we do a segment on Camp David. And about how after Begin and Sadat had their summit up there, she saw Sadat in Egypt a few months later, and he said, "We're going back to Camp David. When should I go?" She said, "Well, Treeland Nursery in Frederick just planted 5,000 tulip bulbs, so come in the spring." And Sadat said, "Oh, I'm going to do that. That's wonderful." And then he got assassinated. So
Wow.
it's very, that's what I keep going back to. This all comes back to the humanity. That's such a human story.
Let me ask you, I don't know much about a video production, but if you're going to go back to the early history of Frederick and focus on maybe 50 years ago, to the 60s, 70s, and the flood and what Mayor Young did for the city, I would imagine there's a lot of photographs, but is there any video from that time?
Yes, and we have actually even uncovered about 2 seconds of Taylor Swift performing
Sure.
at In the Street.
Yep.
In, I think it was 2006, 2008, before she was.
Oh, she
Taylor
came in this
Swift.
building a couple of times, I believe, for our sister station, WFRE. She was, because she lived in Pennsylvania, and she was an up-and-coming country singer at the time. Yep.
We have received a ton of help. Heritage Frederick has been wonderful to us. Mary Mannix in the Maryland room at the public library here have wonderful resources. I will also say that we have uncovered a couple secret sources, SOURCES, of our own, particularly photographs from the 80s and 90s. A lot of really good stuff that people have not seen before. There is a plethora, if I can use that word, of images that are available for the most part. We do have trouble, and some of them we go back and shoot. For instance, we were up at Catoctin Furnace, shot there. We do a segment in the documentary about Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was the first Catholic saint, and we shot up at the shrine there. So, I mean, we wind up being able to portray this stuff.
And this is all going to wind up being within an hour. I mean, you've just done hours and hours of research and filming.
Absolutely. We've been working on this. Well, actually, I have to say we've been working on it for 20 years, because back in the early 90s, early 2000s, I realized, having been from New York and seen this kind of regeneration going on in places in Brooklyn and elsewhere, that's what was happening in Frederick. So for years we have been collecting footage and stories from Fort Detrick and from downtown and from projects. For instance, when we talk about the Golden Mile in the 1990s, we did a bunch of commercials for all the stores that were where Giant was and everything on the Golden Mile. So we have a vast library of our own stuff. We have been located here for years, so sometimes if there was not much work, I'd send guys out shooting, street scenes and everything else here in Frederick. So we had a lot of stuff ourselves, but then, as I say, Heritage Frederick has been wonderful. Visit Frederick has been wonderful, and everybody has very good archives. Actually, Bert Anderson has scrapbooks and scrapbooks of everything that happened in terms of Eveready Square that we're going in next week to pour through. So there's going to be a lot of material in here that even if people think they're experts on Frederick history, they probably have not seen before.
Now, if this is a documentary, why am I seeing, did you have actors who are playing the role of,
do not know.
Younger versions?
No, we do not.
Oh, okay.
No, our documentary is a straight, journalistically sound, factually based documentary.
Okay. We
don't feel like there is a need to dramatize what has happened here in Frederick. The story speaks for itself.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm inspired.
FrederickInspired.com. FrederickInspired.com.
FrederickInspired.com if you're looking for more information on this. What you going to do next at Three Roads?
We have just gone into
WFMD's been around since 1936.
There's a story there, Frank.
There's a story
but
there.
I want to do the Frank Mitchell story.
Yeah,
I want to go back to Mitchell and Miller. That's how long I've been here. I remember
that would go
those.
global. That would.
Yes, just the way COVID did.
I remember seeing. Get a hold of Tim if you haven't finished your project entirely yet, Russ. I saw a picture of Tim in a boat during the flood of '76 in Frederick.
Yeah.
If I can get that to you, or if you're interested, contact Tim.
We're actually using Tim's profile picture when we go back to the Paleolithic era in Frederick.
Sorry, Tim, you can get back to me on that.
You need to be in front of the mic if you want to defend yourself, Tim.
All right. One more time, where to find out more information, the website, and the sneak preview tomorrow.
FrederickInspired.com. Sneak preview tomorrow at the Ordinary Hen Restaurant, North Market Street, the former Volt and Thatcher and Rye.
Cool. Thank you for your time, Russ. And, as I say, we want to have you back again sometime soon, maybe when you have your film out on the street.
Yes.
All right. Mid-Maryland Live will continue. Bob Miller is standing by. I hope you do the same. WFMD News Time is 4:29.
This is 930 WFMD and WFMD.com.